Okay, now we've got our wiring completed. We're just going to go a brief overview to make sure people understand how this is exactly wired. In your system, you'll see a wiring harness. You'll see a red wire, 3 white wires, and a black wire. The red wire will go to your positive terminal next to your positive lead, that which will go to the case. The black goes to in our case, a blue wire, which is going to attach to the BMS, but this is connected to the black. After that, you have supplementary wires, which basically pick up the voltage for each one of the other cells. It's important that these are wired correctly. You cannot mess up the orientation of the cells. If you do, you'll get incorrect voltages and other potential issues. So one of the ways to make sure you do that is just to sort of make sure as you're wiring, you go one at a time. So for example, after the black wire, the next closest cell is going to be this first white wire. So if we follow this wire, it goes to this cell. And that's actually reaching the positive of this. After that, the third wire, which is here, it's going here to this cell, which is reading the positive of this one. And the last white wire, which is here, is actually routed all the way to this cell, which is reading the positive. And then the red wire reaches the red. We've added small little guides where you can use to keep the wire in place, and all that will do is ensure that the wire does not dangle around. So go ahead and utilize that whenever possible to sort of do that. Most of this is going to be covered up by the BMS plate, so it's very unlikely that it'll go any other place. So next, we're going to go ahead and begin working on the BMS plate and show you how that process is. We actually want to interject. You want to cover all of your terminals with Kapton tape, so that's what we're actually going to do next. We're actually going to cover some of these other bolts with Kapton tape as well. They'll just help in case there's ever a situation where if you're not using an insulated tool, you don't end up arcing the battery. So these bolts will also be covered with Kapton tape, which is basically a tape very common for electrical devices to help keep them isolated and make sure that they're not conductive. Okay. To begin with the BMS plate, you will take your BMS device, insert it into the BMS plate, and you'll notice that it is a little undersized, and the reason for that is that the BMS plate actually has to snap in. So when you press it in, you will hear a snap, and once that snap is in place, the BMS will be fully secured and it is held in there with a resistance load. So I'll do it and resume the video in a second. Once the BMS is in, you'll see that it's sort of held in place just by the perimeter around it. So you do not actually need to put any tape or any sort of things. The temperature probe will need to be mounted. We normally mount it back here. However, if you prefer, you can actually route it anywhere else. You'll need to secure it with some Kapton, some other tape, and this will act like a temperature probe. There's 2 temperature probes in our BMS. One's on the board itself. The other one is this external probe. So you'll be able to get readings from the actual unit as well as sort of the ambient air around within the battery. So now we'll begin installing the BMS. Some tips. The tabs will always cover the upper parts of the positive and negative terminal. So when you're setting up the BMS and you're installing it, make sure it's oriented so that the B minus is towards the minus terminal of the battery. It's going to be extremely important because if you have it the other way, you won't be able to reach. So make sure that the B minus is facing towards the terminal, and in your plate that the flaps cover the negative and positive terminals of the battery. We'll then bolt this battery in, but the top plate in using 4 M4 bolts with washers, and that's going to keep the top plate in place. Okay, now we have the BMS plate installed. It's extremely important you do not over tighten these. They just need to be hand snug fit. If you torque them too much, you will actually rip out the metallic brass insert from the plate itself. At that point, the plate will need to be replaced. So please be careful when mounting these in there. You do not want to over tighten these. They just need to be snug, and that will be sufficient. Structurally, your battery is now as solid as it's going to be. The cells are not going to move. It's going to stay in place. And the next, what we'll basically be doing is buttoning up the final few things and installing the top. So we'll then move on to setting up the terminals. So you'll see that we have 2 terminals here. They will go to 2 of these ports. If you buy the premium kit, we will include mounting screws that you will use to mount onto here, as well as this negative terminal kit, which basically is going to be mounting here, allowing negative terminal connection to the upper part of the case, which includes the brass terminals for cables. Okay, and we'll start mounting those shortly. Alright, so we got one of the sides installed, which is basically the blue wire leading on to the negative terminal of the battery. You'll want to tighten these things down. The cable in here, we'll go ahead and bend it, and it is 2-gauge cable, and it is bendable. It may seem like it's being a little resistance, but that's because of the rubber coating. Once it's in place, it will eventually settle, and it should not give any sort of resistance. As far as your second terminal things, this is the negative terminal. You obviously want to make sure you don't arc these two. And one of the ways you can prevent that is by keeping the balance lead disconnected during your install. This will make sure your BMS is disabled so there's no current flowing through. So we'll install this last thing, and then we will basically proceed to putting the top on, which will essentially complete our battery, and it'll be ready for testing.